Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Angela Nardozzi, and I am a settler and guest on Turtle Island, and I'm coming to you from Toronto, the traditional territories of Mississauga of the Credit, and also the Seneca peoples, and also the Petun peoples. And we know that Toronto's been a gathering place of Indigenous peoples for many, many generations and continues to be. And so I'm honored to be here today. And I thought I'd come on a little early just to let people know there's some technical issues. I'm here now, so your camera, and hopefully you can see me, hopefully you can hear me. If there's any issues, I don't know how you would know because you wouldn't be able to see me or hear me, but you can email our tech guru this evening. And his email is in the chat right now. That's sadad.danny@gmail.com. And I think Nancy was asking about inviting someone else in. Nancy, that's who you email. Yeah, and I'm very excited to get started this evening. So just bear with me for a moment. All right, so I'd like to welcome you to the Giganua Omagawin webinar series, which in Anishinaabe means the land or the earth points the way. Which in general refers to education and how we learn. And that's a name that was given to the series by my co-producer in this work, Dr. John Paul Restool of the Doki's First Nation, who's currently at the University of Victoria in the Indigenous Education Department, playing a prominent role there. Dr. Restool may be jumping in this evening, so we might get to see him. We're also joined in this work by one of his graduate students, Erica Finestone, who won't be joining us this evening, but is a crucial part of this work. And I also wanted to mention that this series is sponsored by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, which is funding which Dr. Restool gets for his research to help support Indigenous and non-Indigenous educators take up Indigenous education. So if at any time you leave this webinar, you click close, what you'll find is you're led to an anonymous survey, which we hope you might think to participate in around Dr. Restool's research. Yes, and so a little bit more about myself. I am a sessional lecturer at the University of Toronto in the Masters of Teaching program. I'm also an independent consultant and the author of the newsletter Listen and Learn, which many of you may be a part of, and which I encourage you to sign up for on my website if that's of interest to you. I also wanted to mention that the webinars, the past webinars, are all posted on my website, angelanardozzi.com/webinars, and that after this evening, takes about 36 hours, you will receive the link to the recording of this webinar if at any time you have to jump off for whatever reason. So just to review really quickly the purpose of these webinars, you know, we know that people are at many different places in their learning journey in terms of Indigenous education, and really how you approach it depends on your perspective, whether you're coming from an Indigenous background, a non-Indigenous background. And so Dr. Restool and I really wanted to bring together a variety of people, a variety of voices, to both share knowledge and also to sort of share where they're at with this work. And so you'll see in our past webinars, we've had Dr. Restool as a guest, Alan Corbière, who is an amazing Indigenous scholar and knowledge holder on treaties. Most recently, we've had Becky Greenhow, who spoke to us about her experience as a non-Indigenous educator teaching through Indigenous art and her work alongside Indigenous artists. And this evening, we're really excited, and I'm personally excited because this is an area which I feel I need to learn more about, to have Nikki Lynham here to speak to us. And so I'm just going to turn Nikki's camera and microphone on and let her get all buffered in here. And Nikki's going to introduce herself and maybe tell us a little bit about where she is. And yeah, as we go along, everybody, I'm going to invite you to put your questions right into the chat, which should be on your right-hand side. And as we go through, our tech guru Danny is playing double duty today. He's going to be putting those questions and putting them aside, and I'll be sticking my hand up throughout to ask Nikki questions. So Nikki, how are you doing this evening? Let's just test your mic. Can you say hello to me?
Hello, can you hear me?
I can. I'm just wanting to make sure that the volume is okay. Yes, the volume is okay. Sounds great. So, Nikki, tell us more about yourself.
Hello, everybody, and thanks for having me, Angela. I want to start by acknowledging the land on which I currently live and learn. So I'm living on the Lekwungen unceded territory and also the Wasanich territory. That's otherwise known as Victoria in British Columbia. And I am also a settler on Turtle Island, and really privileged to be doing this work and humbled to be asked to share my learning journey with you. So I've been an educator, a math teacher for 18 years, and for the past 12, I've been working pretty intensively with teachers, mentoring and coaching on how to teach math more conceptually. Because of that work I was doing, I co-founded Educating Now, which is an online resource for teachers on how to use manipulatives, and I'll be touching more on manipulatives later. And really, to be perfectly honest, was very hesitant and scared to step into integrating Indigenous worldviews and ways of knowing and learning into my practice. As a non-Indigenous teacher, it felt really scary. I didn't want to make mistakes and appropriate and you know, do things wrong and make those mistakes. But I've been really fortunate to be a part of a program called Ethnomathematics, and it's out of the University of Hawaii, which again, I'll touch on a little bit later. And that really propelled me forward. And it's also given me the courage to step up and be vulnerable and share this learning journey with all the people that are listening and learning alongside with me tonight.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Nikki. I think I can definitely relate to what you're saying. And I know that many in our audience this evening will also relate to it. And I'm really excited to sort of jump into what you know and what you want to share with us this evening.
Yeah, let's do it. So do I go to the sharing options, or is it already on there for me?
The PowerPoint, you mean? Yes. It should be on your screen. Do you see everything?
Yep.
Perfect. And you should be able to scroll using your arrow keys.
Okay, perfect. So, okay. I'm just trying to minimize that screen. I've gone too far. Okay.
That's okay. It always takes a few minutes to just like really get adjusted to this new technical situation. Sometimes I'm like, I miss my Blackboard. Do you know what I mean? Somebody give me some chalk.
I'm just trying to go back and change. There we are. Okay. So the very first place that I think was the most helpful for me, and again, I'm just going to speak to my own learning journey because I'm not going to assume where other people are at. You know, growing up, I definitely had a very narrow worldview, very much white middle class. And so when we look at worldviews, I realize that this has actually impacted the way I teach, what I think about teaching, how I teach, and what I assess really quite profoundly. And upon learning about different worldviews, I thought, wow, this is something I think all of us need to be aware of. So I just want to say one thing first is there's no one Western worldview and there's no one Indigenous worldview. So what you see here, I've given my source. Chernoff and Russell have written a really interesting article actually on looking at Indigenous ways of learning as well as the math wars, but this comes from them. So when we look at the Indigenous worldview, really what I've been learning is the one main encompassing characteristic is all around relationships. So when we think about knowing and learning mathematics, it's the relationships first and foremost we have with our students and how to develop students' relationships with each other. So I'll talk about how we get into that, but it really can be very different from our Western worldview. So things like alternate answers and strategies are valued for their wisdom because we don't always have to be doing the same things in the same way. Sharing knowledge is important. And so it's that give and take in a relationship, that reciprocity. And knowledge is connected to the place in which it came from. And there's also a very strong valuing of the diversity of the different ways people will know and come to understand and use knowledge. And knowledge isn't necessarily, it's not there for the sake of just knowing, it's there again to further relationships. And that's with people, with our land, with cosmos, with spirit, all of those things. And so, you know, I grew up learning mathematics in this Western view that you'll see over here and taught it that way for some years as well, where it's very linear, singular, static. It's not a living, breathing entity, which in reality it is or can be seen that way. And there was a very strong valuing of that one answer or one way to get the answer. There's hierarchies of knowledge. Even within our society, mathematics itself is often seen as the top most important. Like, you know, when you tell someone that you're a math teacher, they often think you're, you know, more intelligent than someone who, you know, might be a brilliant artist or musician. So we have these sort of ideas about hierarchies within our culture. There's an absolute belief in the scientific method, as well as the valuing and compartmentalizing of knowledge into small concepts and components. And we value the written and abstract versus maybe oral or visual. So I just wanted to start with that because I think it's important for us to reflect about how the lens in which we're viewing. And really what I'm going to be focusing on, this comes from an organization called FINESC, which is the First Nations Education Steering Committee. Fantastic resource. I've given you a link to them later on as well in some of their resources. But these principles, the First Peoples principles of learning, are a guide for me. And they seem really simplistic when you first read them and look at them, but they're actually really complex. And the big learning that came from me right away, and also with support of my mentors, is that it's the way in which we're teaching, which is going to impact our students more than the content. And I know for myself and for my conversations with teachers that I work with, we're very content driven. So like we want the lesson plans and we want the stuff, like the materials that are going to help us to teach, you know, different First Nations, Métis, or Inuit content. And because I'm non-Indigenous, I'm not going to be developing that content, but I will share with you other ways and lots of ways that we can engage with Indigenous ways of knowing and learning that aren't focused on content. Okay. So, and again, this is, you know, it's funny when I did this slide because I originally had it as our responsibility, and then I thought, well, no, I'm not going to put what I think onto you. So I'm just going to tell you what I believe. I really, truly believe that as a Canadian, and especially as an educator, it's my responsibility to learn the true history of this country and how the intergenerational trauma is still alive and well today, and how we're seeing it in our students. It's up to me to learn and understand different worldviews. I have a huge diversity of students that I've taught from cultures all around the world. So what I'm going to be talking about isn't even just pertaining just to one culture, but really I'm speaking to all. I'm working towards using pedagogy that makes math accessible for all learners. And traditionally, I think math has been one of the least accessible subject areas for a lot of people, and it's caused a lot of trauma and damage. So I take that one really seriously. How I've been, you know, working through this journey myself, it started several years ago. UBC offers a fantastic, it's called the Aboriginal Math Symposium. It's every May. It's a one-day workshop conference. It's always been fantastic, and I've gone for the past 3 years. So that was my jumping off point. And it started to expose me to the ideas. I started to be able to have conversations with other people. And every year I've gone, it's been fantastic. I've also taken this course, and it's also a UBC, but it's an online, it's a MOOC. So it's free, it's fantastic. I've given you the link. The next session starts in April 1st, so sign up. I always tell people, sign up with some colleagues so that you can have someone to talk to. My poor husband was my sounding board because I had to share all my new learning with him because that's how I process my learning. So it would be great to have colleagues on board with you. I'm also learning how to engage in community events and activities. And again, this can be really tricky for some of us. I didn't grow up. I didn't have a single First Nations friend growing up. And I'm still working on building relationships and connections with people in community, and it takes time. So I'm working towards that. And I also have to recommend my course that I'm in now. So I'm taking it's called a postgraduate certificate in ethnomathematics. It's out of the University of Hawaii. I wish I could tell you that I got to be there for the whole 11-month course, but most of it's online. So we do a 1-week intensive in July, and then we're going back again in May just for a weekend. And the rest has been online, and it has been exceptional. The teachers are so kind and knowledgeable. My classmates are absolute rock star teachers. I've learned as much from them as from the teachers, and it's going to be a ohana is what we call it in Hawaiian, a family that I'll continue to exchange ideas and collaborate with. So, and I know that might not be feasible for everybody, but I had to at least mention it because this program has been where most of my learning has come from. It's propelled me. All right, so as I said earlier, what I'm really going to be focusing on are the ways in which we can be teaching rather than the content so much. So first and foremost, and I know this seems really obvious, but I don't know that it is super obvious for everybody, is building strong relationships with our students and really getting to know them and their cultures and their families. So how can we engage in that? It's a little bit easier for teachers that have their students with them all day long. I started my career as a high school teacher, and I remember how quickly those class periods go, and then you've got those students gone and a whole new group in. So needing to be a little bit creative around how to do that, but so important when we're considering how people learn best. Collaborative learning is something I'll talk more about. I'm going to unpack and explore most of these ideas. I felt like there probably wasn't enough time to get into all of them, but so I will be going through these now. So I'll just click right there. So collaborative learning, I don't know if you're aware of, and I'm going to say his name wrong because I do every time, even though I try hard not to, Peter Lildahl's work around thinking classrooms, given you some links there if you're unfamiliar with it, but it's a way of grouping students randomly daily that has them collaborating and thinking mathematically together. And, you know, when we think about Indigenous, like when I go back to those First Peoples principles of learning, you know, the words that are in there are things like relational. And relational learning is learning from one another. So instead of it being this one-way street of teachers teaching to their students, we can learn from them. And that's actually one of the ways that I've started to increase my learning and understanding of cultures is from the students themselves. And they also teach me different ways to think about mathematics and different ways to see mathematics. So it's opening us up to relinquishing some control and allowing students to not just collaborate with one another and have that relationship, but also teacher and student to be learning from one another. So that's one style of collaborative learning. Another one that I had started using before I'd seen Peter's work it's called complex instruction, and it's the worst name ever because it's not very complex. And again, I've given you a couple of links, and I really have liked this one. I've had a lot of success in middle schools with this because what it does is it gives students certain roles within their group, and that makes sure that none of them bow out or choose to not participate. And the roles are things like recorder, reporter. You could be the resource facilitator where you go and gather the materials you might need. You could be the organizer who makes sure that everyone's on the same page, or the includer, making sure that every voice is being heard. But working collaboratively is such a huge feature, I think, of just great mathematics classrooms. And that's not to say there isn't a time for quiet individual work. But when I think about that historical classroom where, you know, you've got silent desks in a row, I think we need to move past that model because I don't think that really works for a lot of our students. It does for some, for sure. So we want to make sure that we're allowing space for individual work and individual reflection time, partner work, and then collaborative learning teams. And that can be the scary because group work can often go really wrong. But I've seen it work magic when there's the front loading and it's set up really deliberately. And the way that students learn to communicate and work with one another is, to me, those are developing like vital employability and life skills as well. So it's beyond the math classroom. These are good skills in general. The next one is hands-on and experiential learning. So again, when I go back to my First Peoples Principles of Learning poster that I showed you earlier that I'm using as my guide, this one is key. And we're going to talk about other experiential learning when we get to learning on the land. This is where I started with all of this. And I, to be honest, had no idea when I started using manipulatives and this more experiential learning that this was even an Indigenous way of knowing. I was doing it because the research shows that I had read that it works really well for many students. So I thought, well, let's give this a go. And I've never looked back, because the change in my students, their confidence, how they identify as a math learner and thinker, how much they like math, and their achievement all just skyrocket as soon as I started focusing on what the math means and why it works, rather than on focusing on how to just do the math. And I'm super fortunate to be in BC. We have a curriculum that we started in 2016 where, first of all, Indigenous knowledges and content are woven in through all of our different subject areas. And really what we're being encouraged to do is to interconnect. And that's, to me, the heart of ethnomathematics too, is interconnected learning. So we're not just going to artificially remove mathematics from life, which is what we've traditionally done when we teach it in that very abstract manner, but we're going to see the mathematics that are embedded within everything. You know, one of its purposes, there are many great things about math, but one of it is, you know, to make sense of the world around us. And I'll touch more on that later, but you know, if we don't focus on why it works and students making sense of it, then it just becomes this procedural, you know, rinse and repeat process that, again, I think you're just missing all the beauty and the benefits of it when we do that. So an example you can see here, Cuisenaire rods, they're one of my absolute favorite manipulatives because we can utilize them for math concepts in kindergarten right through to, you know, grade 8, grade 9, because we can use them for multiplying and dividing with fractions. They're great for linear measurements of fractions as well as proportional reasoning. For some of the younger grades, they're wonderful for multiplication, division, the relationship between those, adding, subtracting as difference. That's a big one. Like in grade 2, I read a report in the NCTM a little while ago, and I think the number was like 92% of kids by the time they finish grade 2 only see subtraction as takeaway. But subtraction can also be seen as difference, which is the distance between two numbers. So when we use visual tools like this, we get a deeper understanding of the math. So, you know, I'm sharing with you lots of ideas because I have no idea who any of you, well, I think I know a few of you, but who most of you are, and I don't know where you are in your journey of math teaching. Some of you are already doing this and have been for decades, which is great. I can see Angela's putting up her hand. Yes.
I just wanted to ask it immediately because it's immediately relevant. Tamara, I believe, is wondering how many sets of rods or various manipulatives you recommend for class set.
So because I love having students work together, so those Cuisenaire rods, they come in a set, and depending on your students, with one set between 2. I've also managed with one between 3 if your budget is limited. So, you know, if your class has 30 students, you're going to have 15 sets.
Okay, and then another question has come up as well, maybe from Jamie. I'm not sure if I'm getting that right, but they're asking, is any of this pedagogy for teaching and learning in math that you've done in collaborations with like knowledge carriers or elders from your region on Salish lands or just in Hawaii? So I guess I don't know if you're going to answer that later, but I just thought I'd throw that out there now.
Yeah, I will get to that. Yeah. So.
Okay. All right. We'll let you go then.
And just one more thing with the Cuisenaire rods. You can buy a teacher set of magnetic ones that are quite large that go on your whiteboard, and they're fantastic. I think they're about $20 for the teacher set, and I much prefer those. I love using the document camera, but I find with the Cuisenaire rods it distorts the color and it can make it quite challenging. So those, just a tip there. I find those a lot better. So, and I mean, Cuisenaire rods are one manipulative, right? So we've got all sorts of other ones that are helpful, but the idea is when we're approaching a math concept, we want to look at it as, what are the hands-on materials? Those are our concrete materials. What are the visuals I can use? What other types of models, so that we can actually model and understand the mathematics, and also bridge that with the procedure. So I'm not saying don't teach procedures. We need to look at all of those pieces, but how they are in relationship together. So in BC, our curriculum, it's called a know, do, understand model. So essentially, we want the students to know how to do the math, understand why it works, and apply it to solve problems. So that's sort of the main theme there. Another way to, and this one, comes back when I look at that sort of generalizations around the Indigenous worldviews, is exploring and honoring different strategies and ways of thinking, and allowing students the opportunity to be creative and to create their own math. And some people are really critical of having students create their own algorithms, because they're like, what's the point? They've already been established, just teach them the standard algorithm. But there's not a lot of buy-in or engagement for that, I find. And, mathematics has been created by humans since the beginning of time. So when we allow them to engage in that process, we're giving them the chance to, in their own way, act as mathematicians. It also, their brains are all totally different. And I've been teaching these different strategies, like I said, for, over 12 years now. And I've never had a class where there wasn't some students that liked each of the strategies. Like there was never a time where all of them just preferred this one strategy. If I'd seen that over time, I probably wouldn't, be so passionate about teaching all these different ways. But every single time, there's some students that hook on to a strategy that's quite different from their peers. So here's an example. You can see these students are working towards, they're not finished yet, building an area model for multiplication. So these are the base 10 blocks. Sometimes they're called Dean's blocks. And when we use area models for multiplication, this is something I actually think is a really important strategy to look at and to spend quite a bit of time with. First of all, it's a visual tool. It's directly connected to area and to building or construction. And unlike the traditional algorithm, it doesn't go extinct. Like the traditional algorithm is good for whole numbers and decimal numbers if they do it properly. But this one can be used for whole numbers, for decimal numbers, for fractional numbers, for algebraic numbers. So it's really just a visual model of the distributive property. So instead of using FOIL, we can be using an area model and connecting. So when students, there's so many rules in math if we're teaching rules-based, but if we teach those big ideas and they can see connections between all of the different ideas that they've seen before, it just makes it easier to understand, more accessible, and it doesn't feel like some magic mystifying, subject. It's something that just makes sense. So the area model is also good for division and relating that to multiplication. So, there's lots of different ways, like even when we look at things like adding and subtracting mixed numbers, like you could use the traditional way, which is we turn all of our mixed numbers into improper fractions and do the operation, or you could use an idea of regrouping, and it saves you time from converting all to mixed numbers. You can regroup with your whole numbers and fractions. So, and I've seen students develop that on their own, and it makes sense to their brain, so it's what they use. And in many cases, it's way more efficient than turning into the improper and then finding a common denominator, and then you're dealing with all these big wonky numbers. So, it's just being open to those multiple strategies. And to be honest, most of the strategies that I learned from my students. So when I jumped into this, started teaching this way, 2006, I didn't really have a good conceptual understanding of math, to be honest. And I have a degree in mathematics, but I managed to do that really through the process of memorization. And I had understanding of some of the basics, but I was learning a ton in those first few years when I started teaching math really conceptually and visually. I was having light bulb moments daily. And it was really cool, actually, because the students would teach me a method and then I would call it their name for the rest of the year. So Andrew's method, because I figured if they were the inventor of it, I wasn't going to take credit. So, and that empowers students tremendously. This whole idea of holistic learning, and this is something that I'm just stepping into and really thinking about and playing around with, but it's really looking at all of the learners' personalities, right? So we've got our intellect, our emotions, our imaginations, our body. And so it's more than just, again, parsing pieces of math and teaching those really separately. So if we're looking at exercise and its effects on our health, like you could have kids writing about that and what is exercise or how it makes you feel. There's all sorts of language arts. Obviously, there's a ton of science in that. We could look at the history, like, you know, in different times in history, people didn't exercise for fun or deliberately to exercise because they were so physically active, surviving. If we're looking at then the related math content, depending on what grade level you're working with, you know, you could be looking at adding in time, elapsed time. That's really tough for kids. But if they're looking at how many minutes they spend exercising or playing sports or being outdoors, whatever you want to look at, then they have to do that cumulative piece, which obviously, you know, we're not in base 10 anymore when we're dealing with time. So it adds a challenge. I've done this with grade 8s where we incorporated this into the unit on rates. So students would choose an activity of their, you know, liking, and they would measure their heart rate before, during, and after, and then compare those rates. They also learned about heart rates of different animals so that they were learning about the world around them a little bit. And really thinking about what those heart rates mean and how you know if you've measured it correctly and what would be a dangerously high heart rate, what's low, and all, different things that affect heart rate, like your resting heart rate, can be affected by your, you know, your general health. So just ways of incorporating. So the math is within it all, but instead of it just being a separate thing, you can, you know, integrate your units together. And again, it depends on your grade level. I fully understand for high school folks, that's a lot more challenging. In Victoria, we have middle schools. So a lot of the teachers in grades 6, 7, 8 are teaching most of their classes, or they're working very closely with their teaching partner. So they'll do these kind of integrated units. And of course, for elementary school teachers, it's usually a lot more accessible. So next up here is story. And again, I'm, you know, when I'm using story, I'm using Indigenous resources that are authentic, and I'll talk about some of these links here. But we can also use other stories. This is a book that I love, and you know, and I was reading it again the other day with a math lens on. I have it right here. And I was looking at, there was a, they're talking about the great city of, I'm going to probably say it wrong, of Cahokia. And they're talking about these huge, I'm going to show you the picture, these huge clay mounds that were built as a way to, they did it for a lot of ways, but you know, to honor the spirit world. And it talks about, it gives you like the measurements of this, and these people built this with buckets of clay. So then it actually does the math in the book and tells you it's, you know, 15 million buckets of dirt used to build this. But those are ways that I use story to get the students hooked into and thinking about things, and then they're responsible for doing the math, and then we can see if their math matches what the authors of the book have seen. In an ideal world, you can invite an elder or a knowledge keeper to join you and listen for the math that can be found within. And that's the hard work, and it's something that takes practice, but there's usually something mathematical within there. And if not, that, you mean, you're still learning really valuable stories and about culture. But I have found that when I listen to these stories, I'm like, oh, there's mathematical thinking involved most of the time. So just to talk about the links here, there's SFU have put together a video series called Math Catcher, and they're fantastic. I believe most of the references are Blackfoot, so not super relevant for Coast Salish, but I still use them. The kids really enjoy them, and again, it's an authentic resource. There's also the link there for Strong Nations. So they're a publishing company out of Nanaimo, which is just nearby to Victoria here, and I love their site because they've vetted all the resources. I know that's sometimes an issue. You're not sure if what you're getting is an authentic resource that would be wise to use. So they've done that for you. So the first link is just their straight out store. The second one is if you search for math. So there's some really good math resources in there, as well as storybooks that incorporate math and culture. So those are ways that you can use story. And if you don't have access to a person, then at least using good resources. Yeah.
It's a really great question, and I think you might be getting to it, but I thought I'd throw it in there. Christina's asking, and giving the context that she's working in an urban board with limited access to elders and knowledge keepers, and so she's wondering, how would she replicate that experience in a non-appropriative way, without having the ability to maybe invite those folks in always.
Yeah, and I'm in the same situation. We have a few people that we have access to, but it's very limited. And like I said, I'm still working on building relationships. So that's, again, I would use books. So it's not your story or your voice, you're reading their story. There's also a decent amount on the internet. So I've used, I call kind of like a primary source. So I've created a lesson plan around using Lahal, which is a game that different First Nations have used from all across Canada and the United States, actually, in different ways. And the beginning of the lesson, though, starts with a video of people from Burns Lake, which is also in BC, talking about the history and the importance of Lahal. So I start the students with, this is what we're learning about. I'm not going to teach them the history and the culture because it's not mine, but I found a video with people who could, and then we have a discussion about the importance of the game historically and contemporary, and why we're spending time learning it and talking about it, not just for math, but as a way of learning about the culture on whose land we're living. And so that piece came first. Then we learned about the game, we played it, and moved on from there. So I didn't have someone to come in and teach the game, so I've used videos, and I've done the same with drumming. I found a great video of a man named George, I've forgotten. Anyways, I have it written down, but he talks about how he creates drums and the importance of drumming. And so we use that. We also do have a phenomenal educator in our district who can come in and teach drumming protocol, which is amazing, but she's really busy because we've got lots of schools that are wanting her to come in and do that work. So I've tried to source out videos that I can use, or print resources that I can use if we don't have easy access to elders or knowledge keepers.
Someone's asking, just for clarification, to spell the name of the game.
Oh, Lahal is, well, it's actually spelled a few different ways. Lahal, and sometimes it's Slahal.
Okay, great.
And I did share with you, I've shared with Angela, and she'll share with you. I know I shared the drumming lesson, and that will have the links for those videos, but I'll also send you the Lahal, so you can put that one up. So it's a whole lesson sequence with all the documents that you can use, because that one actually, I'm hesitant to share, like some of the lessons I've started working around creating are very Victoria based, so it wouldn't be super relevant. And also I'll talk to you more about that moving forward, but I will share that as well. Yeah. And then, even if you don't want to use cultural-based stories or books, there's just a ton of really great stories, and just storytelling in general it's a great way for people to learn. Like all humans, we learn well through stories. So I've given you on the next slide here just some examples right in the first bit there. And I've got some here, and you think, oh, this is just for little kids. And I do use Equal Schmeequal for kindergarten, but I've also used it for grade 8, where we understand the idea of, what equality means. So in this case, you've got these little animals that end up on a teeter-totter. And at first they're doing 3 and 3, but the problem is they're all totally different sizes. You've got a mouse and a bear and a rabbit and a wolf and what have you. So these types of books, and the examples there, and there's hundreds more, there was a link on the previous slide, are a way to just engage in that process of using story to think about and explore math. So it can be a jumping off point, which was the example I gave here, like a context that's a historical context, but we're learning about maybe in social studies, but then we can jump off into some math exploration. And there's a great little book called The Cedar Tree, The Heart of Our People, which I've used as a jumping off point. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Or it can be the story of the history of math. And that's something that I'm still learning. So I actually took a history of math course at university, but it was extremely Eurocentrically focused. I didn't learn about Indigenous peoples doing math. So I'm looking for that knowledge. And again, it can be hard to find. I've reached out to different people and lots of different colleagues, and together we're trying to parse together. But there is some, and I've given you, I'll talk about it in the resources, some links. There are people that have been doing this work, and not necessarily focused on like, you know, our local Indigenous peoples, but cultures around the world, and just looking at how people have been mathematizing since the beginning of time, and, you know, honoring and respecting and teaching about that instead of just the Greeks, who, you know, they formalized a lot of the proofs, which is why we focus so much on them. But even, you know, like Pythagorean's theorem, well, they figured like Egyptians, Babylonians have been using that 3, 4, 5 triangle to find right angles for hundreds of years. And they think that maybe Pythagoras actually got the idea from them. And so, I mean, we don't know, we can't go back in time, but just revisiting. This is a little picture of some kids doing a skit. So I love having the kids act out the math and embody it in a very, you know, real way. And they love doing that. So they can create their own skits or perform skits using manipulatives or any sort of hands-on thing to show, especially things like division and what's the difference between equal sharing and equal grouping. It's a hard one to conceptualize. So when they act it out, it just makes it make so much more sense. So here's an example. So I started with the story, the cedar tree, the heart of our people. So we learned about why the cedar tree is so important for Coast Salish peoples, and then looked at all the different uses for it. And some of the uses that they share in the book are around making different poles as well as canoes. So then we also looked at this TED Talk, she's actually a Canadian researcher, and it's an interesting concept that's all about how trees talk to one another. It's quite mind-blowing. What I love about this TED Talk is that, you know, we know that, well, every Indigenous culture that I've heard about so far has an understanding that we're all connected. And this is coming back to this idea of relationship. And it's something that Western science has often rejected. This whole idea that they feel like it's too spiritual or it's not scientific. I'm not sure what the arguments are, but it's not jiving for people. Well, this woman researched how trees actually do communicate within their root systems. And there's a very strong connection, and they're actually more collaborators and cooperators than they are competitors. So it completely flipped what Western scientists thought and how they viewed trees and their connection. And it also makes you start thinking about things like clear cutting in a totally different way, because they also found that there were mother trees and that they communicated and protected and adopted other different species of trees to be within their families that they would pass nutrients to. So what we did is we started with learning about these trees and why they're so important. And then we looked at, okay, so how would we figure out the height of a tree? What tree would make a good canoe or a good pole? And what are the things we're looking for? And all sorts of really great math coming in there, where you can use the ratio, as you can see in the picture shown, to estimate the height. And that's actually a pretty good estimate. There's other ways too, and you'll see those in the activities that I sent to Angela. You can estimate the age of trees by finding the circumference at breast height and then multiplying it by the growth factor. I've given you that information, as well as, this is more forestry, but estimating volumes of trees, and it's more old school forestry, how things used to be done. But those are types of ideas that you could jump off from a story, investigate some mathematics within it. And it also gets kids outside and really learning by doing. And that whole visual idea of ratio is just so much more powerful than, I think about the two numbers and the little arrows we used to see, and how to find an equivalent ratio. So that brings me to my next one, which is learning on and from the land. And again, this is new for me. I am really learning a lot. I'm trying to learn the native trees and species. My husband and I actually ripped out 80% of our grass and have replaced our yard with native species, and are part of a program that are helping to support the Garry Oak ecosystems. There are so many things that I've been playing around with and doing outside, and it's fun, it's engaging, and again, it's almost like we're physically embodying the math, especially when we're looking at estimating, using our stride length to estimate 1 meter. And then this is what the kids are doing in this picture. So they're just starting to figure out what a meter is. And then we started estimating, how far do you think it is? How many meters from here to that tree? So they make their estimate, and then they start doing these big walks. And then we can actually measure if we want, but we can compare why are our estimates so different? We're really engaging in the mathematical thinking and learning there. One of the lessons that I've done recently is we're looking at the health of our gorge waterway. And it's been a waterway that's historically and contemporarily very important for the Lekwungen peoples. So we're looking at how do we keep it healthy? How do we keep it vibrant? And we use data that they've had since 1946 on fish counts. They have a fish fence that's constructed using like a weir type system. And then the students are using all of those numbers and all of that data to make sense of it. What is this telling us about the health? Like if it's slowly declining, if it's doing this, if it's, what can we assume, or what can we learn about the health from those numbers? And we also have access to data on the salinity levels at different days, the temperatures. And that little link there is, shout out to one of my ethnomath colleagues, Michelle and Kate. We're looking at this, and it's a whole little, that's a lesson sequence for you. But what it does is it takes like data like this, and the kids turn it into a piece of art. So they start with like a line graph, and then their piece of art is related to the environmental context. So it's environmentally focused. So it might be looking at the rising temperatures of the ocean or the decline of glaciers. And then their math, picture is also an artistic picture. So that's pretty cool. These are just some more ideas on place-based learning, because that doesn't also, like, place-based learning isn't just outside learning or on the land. It can also be, depending if you're an urban school, school I work at, we have kind of both. We've got lots of parkland, which is great, but we also have businesses nearby. So looking at, connecting with them, and what are your losses, or like how much fruit are you throwing away, or how many vegetables are you throwing away each week, and how can we reduce that? So things that are really focused around sometimes some social justice issues or environmental factors, and looking at, connecting back to relationship, and that relationship with the land is really important. So at beach cleanup, looking at the ratios, like service learning is also a great activity to meld with math, and looking at the ratios of marine debris or microplastics and the length of time to clean them up. That was a lesson Kaipo Tam, one of our instructors, led us through in Hawaii, and teachers in Victoria are doing a very similar lesson. It's just the intertidal species are vastly different in those two places. Desmos is a great online tool that can help you map out, so students can go out and look at slopes in nature and then bring it back on, upload it into Desmos, and then compare and look. So again, it's seeing the math around us and engaging with the math around us, rather than that static, textbook worksheet approach. This is another one we did. So looking at a navigation unit, and I jumped off from this, and the resources I'll show you is math and cultural context. And the problem I had with the resource, they're phenomenal. The problem is they're based in Alaska, and they were created with Yupik elders, which is the absolute way to do it. I'm going to talk about that, so I'm not going to dive into that too much. So I honored, and we learned a little bit about Alaska, because those were the people that created the lesson. And then we also then compared it to our own lands and our own landmarks and our territories. And so we learned everything about different navigations and estimating distances. Here we were looking at sun shadows. So we had the students come out and measure the sun shadow. That's just like a pencil sticking on like a little piece of putty. And they measured it every hour. And then we took them back into the classroom, and it was amazing, because they also started to see that it looked like a clock, and holy smokes, and like, what's going on with the angles, and is it the same in a clock? Why not? And they were amazed by how much math and thinking goes into devices like compasses that they just take for granted, or a clock that they take for granted. So that's another example of getting them out and, just learning about, and the other thing about that one, which was cool, and it was new learning for me, was learning about solar noon, because I was like, what? It's not really at 12 o'clock? No, depending on where you live, it can be vastly different. So we looked, and that's to do with the size of the shadow. So longer shadows, different times a day, that type of thing. So we could look at the angles as well as the lengths of the shadows. So coming back to that question from before, and the question was, someone asked me, have you co-created resources with Coast Salish, or in my case, Lekwungen peoples? And the answer is not yet, but I sure do want to. So I've been trying to and hoping to for a while. And, it's slow process. That's where I look at, I'm just going to click here for a moment, the resources. So these are math in a cultural context. And I use these all the time. They are fantastic resources because there are some similarities in some of the aspects. So we also have longhouses. There's a whole unit on longhouses to do with measurement. We also can navigate. We also have fish drying racks that are similar. So I've looked to see what is similar to the Coast Salish and the Lekwungen peoples and tried to meld. In an ideal world, I'm not creating this at all. I'm co-creating or working alongside Lekwungen elders and knowledge keepers. And I've approached my district with that, and we're working towards that. We're just not quite there yet here. So that is the goal. And that's my encouragement. And I know that a lot of people don't have that option at this moment. And so I think what happens sometimes is when we're not able to go about creating those cultural, really contextualized lessons, that we think, well, that's the only way to go about doing this. And so that was my point, is even if you don't have the knowledge yet and you're not connected to communities, elders, or knowledge keepers, you don't have that access, you can be engaging in Indigenous ways of learning without it being exactly connected to that culture. This is where we want to get to, but I'm just encouraging people to take baby steps. And that's what I've done, because it was either that or do nothing at all. And I feel like the doing nothing at all is not an option.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in here. I really appreciate the approach you're taking, because I think one of the things that I struggle with, and that Dr. Rastool and I have a lot of conversations around, are like, what is the balance between making relationships and really honoring voice and making space for Indigenous folks, and ensuring, let's be frank, there's not enough space right now made for Indigenous people in our education system. We need more full-time on-staff positions, because so often, I know myself personally, I'm struggling I need to find an honorarium, but often they're very small, and they're not respectable, right, in terms of like how much these folks deserve when they're bringing so much wealth of knowledge. Also, I know that a lot of elders and wisdom keepers are really busy and engaged in work with their own community.
Exactly.
Right? Yep. So I wonder about the ethical implications, rather, of like saying, here's our school board, come help us, but when we know that, and it's not that cut and dry, it's not that black and white, Indigenous people are here learning and non-Indigenous people are here learning. That's not the case, right? But we worry about these things, we discuss these things as well. And so I just want to acknowledge, like, I appreciate it's complex, and also I really appreciate the resources that you've brought in that have already been developed. Like I think on one of your slides, can I do this? Oh, wait, sorry. That show me your map.
Yeah.
And the work being done out in Mi'kmaq territory. And it's a little bit of that process, right? Like in almost every subject area that I work in, and when I'm writing my newsletter, it's all about like, well, I found this paper and I found this. And it kind of still feels like we're doing a little bit of curating and going with it and innovating, bringing in people when we can, understanding when we need to step forward, when we need to step back, because there isn't like one way. And we're really, I think, I might be wrong on this, but like in a lot of places, we're the first generation of educators trying to do this work in a good way.
Yeah, exactly.
So I just really appreciate all the nuance you're bringing to this. And it's not perfect, but we're doing our best.
And actually, thank you for saying that, because I want to say to everyone too, I'm super open to feedback. And I'm sharing with you my email at the end, and like honestly, critical feedback, anything that can help me in my learning journey, because I'm not the expert here, but I'm just so passionate about stepping into this. And yeah, like I said, I feel like I've been inactive for too long out of fear. And when I have been doing this, it's such a positive experience. And because I'm not placing myself as the person teaching the culture, it doesn't feel inappropriate in that way. So the other thing I want to say about if you do have the opportunity to work with elders and knowledge keepers, my classmate and friend Kate and I were talking about this just the other day, and it was saying like it's a switch from, I think that the traditional approach would be you approach someone and say, hey, I want to do this unit on ratios. How do you use ratios? Rather than share with me some of your stories and knowledge that you're willing and able to share with me. And again, you can find the math. Like it's really a collaborative co-creation, rather than you coming to the table with your set ideas and agenda and trying to get them to sort of meld it in. The other thing I've told teachers, and this is how it felt more authentic for me, was for a number of years, I was starting with the math concept, and I was trying to parachute like an Indigenous context or cultural relevance into that. And I never did anything with it because it never felt right. I knew it wasn't right. I knew it was tokenism. And then I had an aha moment, which I'm sure other people have had way quicker, but all of a sudden I was like, oh, I'm doing this backwards. I need to start with the cultural context or the relevancy or the story and parachute the math in. And again, math is, one of its benefits is that it may be useful in understanding. So here are some examples, if you're using art, and again, I need to say, make sure the art you are using is you have permission to use. In our district, we do have artists who have shared their pieces with us, but it's not something you want to just Google and randomly take a piece of Indigenous art. So ensure you have proper permissions. But there's tons within there around symmetry. You got your transformations, your rotations, reflections, translations. Body ratios are huge in terms of carvers use them, people building canoes to actual body sizes, like the different kayaks that can be built so that they're custom to each person. So they're using a person's body ratio and their arm ratio. And even just using body ratios to estimate distances. Scale, you could use art to look at different scale in terms of like when people are doing huge murals, they do it in pieces, right? So you're even acting like an artist in that sense. And of course, estimating housing, no matter which part of Canada or the States you're in, the houses are all totally different. So, you could explore different houses from different parts or look at the one that's local to you. And you can be exploring area, perimeter, scale, volume, capacity, all sorts of things, time it takes. Drumming. So there's math within music and beats, but there's also a lot of math that goes into making the drums. But again, in the lesson that I shared that you'll have, I started with that cultural piece, and then we got to, okay, if we were going to make this drum, we've been really lucky in our district that the district has collaborated with our local elders and have agreed upon a protocol of making class sets of drums within the school. And so the students are engaged. We have our different educators coming in, teaching the whole process. The teaching is through the making. I got to be a part of it. It was so, we woke the drums and then we learned songs. And again, we have certain songs that have been gifted to us in our district. So those are the only songs that we use and play. And so that piece is huge, and that comes before, okay, so now if we were going to make these drums, we want to ensure that we're using the hide in the most respectful way possible, because an animal gave its life to give life to this drum. So we don't want to be willy-nilly making mistakes. So, that whole process is very mathematical and very logical, and there's so many different variables. Artifact sharing we did that in my ethnomath on our first day, and it was so powerful. And it can be a math artifact. I've had students do that, and the artifact doesn't have to be a thing either. Like some brought in a game, like one student whose family originates from Africa brought in Mancala and talked to us about that. Another student came in and she, her ancestry is Egyptian. So she was sharing how Egyptians were the first people to use a standard unit of measurement. That's why the pyramids were so accurate. But it can also be a mathematician, maybe a lesser known one, all sorts of ideas there. And you know, when we're learning on and from the land, if we can incorporate some traditional ecological knowledges, some important landmarks, historical landmarks, and significances of the land, that would be great. And that can be hard. Google's not great for that. I've been asking, and I get little snippets, and sometimes I'm like, I don't even know if this is real, but try is it's literally what I'm trying to get at here. So in terms of the resources, yeah, the Show Me Your Math, fantastic. I got to attend a mathematics conference, and we were looking at decolonizing mathematics, and Lisa led us on that, and she was fantastic. There's a collection of resources. It's out of the University of Toronto there that I've used. The video series, I've watched all those videos, again, out of Ontario. Those are fantastic. Different build, like the housing and the different things that they've done there. The FINESC resource is for grade 8-9. Again, it's related to BC, but it actually can be quite generalizable, some of the things. And it gives you some good advice about, if you do have the opportunity to speak to elders, how to do so in a respectful manner. The Math Catcher series I already talked to you. The ethno-math lessons are from previous ethno-mathematics participants, and they are almost entirely, well, I think they are entirely Hawaii-based. I'm the first Canadian to be a part of the program. Well, this is the first year that they ever did a postgraduate certificate. Before, it was an in-service. It started off as a math course for Hawaiians. Anyways, but there's a ton of really great lessons that I've used, because there are some similarities, but it might just give you ideas. So it's not that you're going to teach the Hawaiian culture, but it might spark something for you. And then Ron Eglash has done some really neat work in all sorts of different cultures in terms of ethnomathematics, and he has a lot of free resources. And so that is that link there. So, you know, I wish I had a book and books I could tell you, but really it's so dependent on where you're at that there is no one size fits all. There is no textbook. And I really, truly believe there shouldn't be. And as Angela said, like, that whole idea of co-creating that was, you know, recently I asked about the language, and Lekwungen is, you know, really working on, like, the community's working on their language revitalization. And I said, I'm really interested in that. And I was told they're working on it within their community for right now. When they're ready to share with us in our district, they'll let us know. And I said, great, thank you. Like, I'm here and ready and willing. So I've been told, you know, step back, and I do, but I'm also stepping forward in that way. And I've reached out to people and said, I'd love to collaborate with you. And I do have some interest, but like I said, it's a slow, rocky process. So.
It makes a lot of sense. And I really appreciate, again, having that sensitivity and that humility to know when to do so, yeah. Right? You know, a question's come up from Monica, and she's asking about assessment in relation to Indigenous ways of knowing. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that to share with us?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I feel like most of our assessment practices are really the antithesis to what I'm talking about here. So it's tricky. One thing that I've been working on is, so again, and I'm just going to speak to BC because that's my world at this moment. We have curricular competencies that are, so in our new curriculum, we've got our content, our competencies, and our big ideas. And the competencies are really those, you know, it's things like visualizing to solve problems and communicating and justifying your mathematics. And I feel like those are more what I would assess when I'm working towards this. But yeah, like, it's, the assessment is part is tricky. Formative assessment, absolutely. Embedded formative assessment, I think, is good teaching, and that's for all learners. It's letting them know where they're at and what the goal is or where they're heading towards. So there's ways that we can use those. In terms of summative assessments, I don't, you know, how you want to incorporate that. That was an issue we had when we did our whole navigation unit. The teacher's like, how do I assess this? And I'm like, I don't know. Do we have to? Like, do we have to give it a letter grade, or can we use it as a learning experience, right? So that's thing I'm still really grappling with, but definitely, you know, if we're using a rubric so the students know what their outcomes are and what the expectations of their learning are, I think that's a good approach as well when we go to give them their feedback so that they know, you know.
Okay, that's helpful. Yeah, I hear you about that struggle around assessment when it comes, because so much of this is just good life learning, right? And I think those grades, I just know the anxiety around those grades that some students have, and Oh boy. Instead of going down that rabbit hole, and I just want to let you know, Nikki, as you've been giving this awesome presentation, there's been a lot of engagement on the boards. I want to thank everybody for adding their comments, people talking about the places where they're from and what's being practiced, some people putting in their own resources, and now there's a little bit of a conversation happening around assessment and what that's about. And yeah, people have put different resources up. So I want to thank you for that. I want to remind everybody that before you leave today, anything in the chat will disappear. It will not be recorded in the video. So I think that's a really important thing to know. If there's anything in that video, in that chat that you don't want to lose, give it a copy paste. Nikki, I see you've got your final notes up, including your email address, which is good. Someone just asked for it. Yeah, somebody's been copying stuff. Right, Nancy's asking for it. Nancy's also saying she's been copying stuff rapidly as we go. Nikki, are you on Twitter?
I am. Oh my gosh, I'm so not the techie person. It's Nikki Lynham, at Nikki Lynham.
Okay, cool. And I think if anybody cannot find Nikki, I'm at @Nardozzi on Twitter, and I've tagged Nikki in a few of my recent posts. You have to wade through all my retweets about what's happening with Jody Wilson-Raybould, but you'll find Nikki in there, I promise. Nikki, what are some of your final thoughts? We're rounding out the hour. What are some of your final thoughts?
I'm just copying and pasting. Yeah, it's at Nikki Lynham. I just wanted to double check for that. Let's type it in there just so that people have it. Yeah, so really, like I said there, the collaborating is key, but also, our students and their families. So we might not have access to elders and knowledge keepers, but I've been watching my colleagues putting the offer out there, like, do you have anything you'd like to share? And it's been really interesting, having these family members come in and share. And like, we had a dad of one of our students came in and they're Cherokee, and he shared with us a few stories and shared a song, and we drummed together. So, kind of broaden the scope of who we can invite in. And this is, again, true for all of our learners. I think most of us have an Indigenous education department, obviously. Go there. They often, they might not have the math specific. And like I said, we don't have local math resources, but there's enough other local resources that I've been able to use. And, I read the stories and I jump off from there. A lot of people say this is really overwhelming. I don't know what to do. Start small, start where you're comfortable. And like I said before, my guide is the First People's Principles of Learning. So I'm constantly rereading that and looking at those bits and how can I, incorporate those into the way I'm teaching daily, not a one-off, here's our First Nations math lesson, but how can I do that on a regular basis? And really, when I look at those principles, I'm like, this is just really great learning for all students. So it's not, we're not aiming for a particular, race or culture, but really we're looking at how can we meet all of our learners' needs. And yeah, I got to view a few of those things on the assessment. I feel like, I feel like we could talk about this for days on end, and we need to, and same with assessment, like there's so many ways we can go about it, and definitely conferencing and talking with our students and moving away from, your traditional math.
Yeah.
Would be wonderful. I know a lot of people that have gotten away from tests altogether because they found they're not needed. Between journaling, conferencing, and project work, the tests were redundant. They weren't necessary.
Okay. Yeah, I hear ya. Thank you so much, Nikki. This has been such a great hour. I really appreciated all the questions that you answered, and you really shared so many things. Some people are asking about the posting and where this is going to be available and the resources. So I'll tell you this. Nikki sent me some resources. And so what's going to happen is I will be posting, as I've mentioned, and I'll send everybody, because I have all your emails through the Eventbrite. I'm going to send in probably about 36 hours, maybe 48, depending on how long Demio takes. I'll be sending the link to my website, angelanardozzi.com/webinars, where we'll post the video. And then anything that Nikki has agreed to share, right, I will share that as well there. So you have any links that she's agreed to share. So yeah. Oh, and look, everyone's so excited. There's so
you know what I'm loving too, I just have to say, is like, I just feel like we have such a strong like allyship going on, and like just the fact that so many people were interested in this, and you know, there are some other, you know, incredibly knowledgeable people out there, and I love that all these teachers on here are already connecting and with each other, and that's what we need to be doing, is relying and sharing within ourselves instead of trying to like reinvent the wheel. And that's where all my learning is coming from. You know, I'm doing a lot of reading, but I'm reading people's work that was their learning. So it's, yeah, I love this. This is so inspiring.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with you. You know, one of the things that I hear from the teacher candidates I teach so often is like, what if I make a mistake? You know, and they're reluctant. They're reluctant to try. And what I really appreciate about your modeling is, again, saying that, yeah, you know, maybe I will make a mistake, and it's still worth doing. Like, we have to do it, listen, and you know, mistake isn't the end of the world, right? Like, I think the mistake is an opportunity to learn, an opportunity to build closer relationship with Indigenous colleagues and communities, and to just get better at what we do. And so, but it's a hard thing. It's a hard thing to put ourselves out there and to be open to that.
But it's, you know, it's practicing what we preach. We talk about how mistakes in mathematics are a hugely important part of the learning. And, you know, and I think our job too, and it is hard for us, but it's to learn how to take the feedback we get when we make mistakes and apologize appropriately and do better next time, right? Like, when we know better, we can do better, but it's listening. And it's like, and I've been given feedback, like I've been told I talk too much and I'm not allowing enough space. And I'm like, okay. And like, that's a very valid, feedback. And so I'm learning how to be more mindful of my approach when I'm working with different people.
Thank you for sharing that. Just to let people know, just as we sign off, some people are expressing the desire to share their emails. From where I'm sitting, unfortunately, I can't match names to emails because the Demio and the Eventbrite are separate. So if you do want to put your email right into that chat, go ahead. But it's not, unfortunately, something that we're able to do because our lists are separate. But yeah, anyway, all that being said, I'm so glad that there's so much connecting happening. Yep, people are just, there's a lot of emailing happening. Great. This chat's on fire tonight.
Love it.
This never happened before. I'm really focused in on it.
And maybe I just want to too. Like, I want to see all the links people shared. So yeah, so people are like, please keep the chat open so we can make a copy and paste.
That's a great idea. And I think I will do that. So what's going to happen, everybody, is I'm going to, after we say goodbye, I'm going to turn off my video. I'm going to turn off my microphone. I'm going to do the same for Nikki, but we're going to leave the webinar on, at least for a good, I feel like 15 minutes, because no big deal. We're just going to edit that out of the final video instead of just having blank space. And you all can catch up with one another in whatever way that you want, which is great. Nikki, listen, I just want to thank you so much. I know so much work goes into preparing this, putting these slides together. You took so much care, meeting with me, agreeing to do this. And so I want to thank you for sharing your knowledge today.
My pleasure. And HKCM, thank you very much for the invite and allowing me to step out of my comfort zone and share my learning journey with other people. I hope it helped.
Wonderful. And thank you for being so open to sharing so many resources and your personal email. I just want to remind everybody that two things. This is Dr. Rastul's part of his SSHRC-funded research. So when you do exit today, you will be led to an optional and anonymous survey. And also, if you want to keep track of these webinars, one way you can do that is by signing up for my free newsletter on Indigenous education called Listen and Learn. And you can find that through my website, AngelaNardozzi.com, by clicking on Indigenous education. There should be a form that pops up, or if you click on Listen and Learn, or a blue bar at the top of the website, or I think there's so many different ways that I'm really persistent. Okay, this has been great. Nikki, you're amazing. I'm going to turn off our cameras and let people chat on as they wish. Everyone, I hope you have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, Angela.
Bye. Thank you, Nikki.